Hello, one and all, to the first Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai International Center for Philosophy seminar series. It's a very long title for the second half of 2025. I'm your host and convener, Associate Professor MRX Dentith, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Mike LeBuffe, and our respondent, Jinse Liu. I met Mike in Dunedin earlier this year. Dunedin is currently having an extreme weather event, so I'll make this introduction short lest I go on so long that the weather actually knocks out the internet in Dunedin and stops Mike from talking. Mike gained his PhD from UC San Diego and is currently the Bayer Chair of Early Modern Philosophy at the University of Otago. He's the author of 3 books on Spinoza, From Bondage to Freedom, Spinoza on Human Excellence, Spinoza on Reason, and Spinoza's Ethics, a Guide. Some of his more recent work includes an article in Mind, Citizens and States and Spinoza's Political Treatise, and a forthcoming chapter in the critical guide to Hobbes's Leviathan, Human Motivation in Leviathan. His talk today is titled Laws and Nature in Descartes and Spinoza, and I'll ask Mike now to take the floor.
Thanks very much, Jim. Very glad to be here. And thanks, Jinza, for offering your commentary. Really valuable to me. Thank you for coming. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation now. I don't know how to go backwards in the presentation, so this is a technological feat I have not attained yet. So I may go back and forth between screen sharing in the course of the presentation. But for a start, okay, can you see that okay? All right. So the title of my presentation today is Laws in Nature from Descartes to Spinoza. The main point of the adventure is to get a sort of angle on Spinoza's metaphysics. Most of us know that Spinoza was a substance monist, and if you've read the first part of the Ethics, you see that it starts with an intricate argument to monism. That argument is really interesting and worth investigating, but can also be hard to appreciate. Why should we think that there's just one thing? I hope in the course of this presentation to give you a reason, a sort of philosophical motivation for Spinoza's substance monism. Accounts of laws and nature. So here's an introduction to the 2 central concepts for this talk. First, and this is an older tradition, it goes back to Aristotle, the view, which I'm going to call essentialism, is the view where we explain a given effect in nature by showing how it follows from principles or laws that are distinctive of the nature of the thing in which the effects occur. Okay, so that's essentialism. Here are a few examples. Here's Thomas Aquinas. Thomas writes, whatever is attributable to a thing is either caused by principles of its own nature, as risability in a human being, or else comes to the thing from some external principle, as light in the air comes from the influence of the sun. I added existence there because that question might arise later in the presentation. The main point to see here is that we think of laws of nature, I think, today, without thinking about the laws of things nature. So principiis naturae suae, of its own nature, is, to our eyes today, strange to think that we're talking about laws that belong to the nature of a thing. That's why I pick out this passage as being representative of essentialism. Here's another example. Bacon's a very complex figure. Um, I think he also had universal laws of nature that didn't belong to things natures. But here's a passage where I think he expresses what I'm calling essentialism. He writes, all of this happens because of the tendencies of water following the law of its own gravity, shaping itself into a greater and a lesser sphere with respect to the center of the world. So again, we're talking about a thing, water, having its own laws of its own gravity. So if you think about a thing's nature or essence as providing its laws, that's the motivation for the label essentialism. A different tradition, which I think is more familiar to most of us, um, and associates most closely, I think, with Isaac Newton, I'll call unificationism. Uh, this is the view that nature conforms with laws because it's in some way uniform. And the objective of science is to generate the most general descriptions of how nature operates. So we're no longer talking about things natures, we're talking about nature's simpliciter. And the objective is to generate laws that describe not any particular thing like water or light. Let's talk about everything. Here are some examples of unificationism. This is from the preface of Newton's Principia itself. All the difficulty of philosophy seems to be in this. From our investigation of the phenomena of motions, we investigate the forces of nature. Then, from these forces, we demonstrate the remaining phenomena. The idea is we start with a few things, we generate a very general law on the basis of our understanding of those few phenomena, and then we can apply that law to more things. So he goes on to give a particular example. In the third book, we offer an example of this in the explication of the world system. Indeed, there, from celestial phenomena, by propositions demonstrated mathematically in prior books, are derived the forces of gravity, by which bodies tend toward the sun and each planet. Next, from these forces, again by mathematical propositions, are deduced the motions of the planets, the comets, the moon, and the sea. Once we have the universal theory of gravitation, we can apply that to new phenomena and understand everything. So the great accomplishment of Newtonian physics is unifying gravitational theories for celestial objects and ordinary objects. The laws are universal, they unify everything. Locke and then Hume set out to give a kind of a grounding for Newtonian physics in our epistemology and metaphysics. And I think Hume is recognized by philosophers of science today, like Philip Kitcher, for example, as the sort of the classical source of unificationism. Here's a passage from Hume's inquiry that's representative. Hence, we may discover the reason why no philosopher who is rational and modest has ever pretended to assign the ultimate cause of any natural operation, or to show distinctly the action of that power which produces any single effect in the universe. I think this is setting himself up in opposition to what I'm calling essentialism. He's not going to say, oh, I know the nature of water, such that I know how it's going to behave. We don't actually know the natures of anything. All we do is look for regularities. It is confessed that the utmost effort of human reason is to reduce the principles productive of natural phenomena to a greater simplicity, and to resolve the many particular effects into a few general causes by means of reasonings from analogy, experience, and observation. So Hume here characterizes the project of science as the generation of the most general laws that unify uh, the greatest different phenomena. So notice these last two passages were characteristically early modern. The first figure I'm going to talk about today, Descartes, I think is sort of a late Copernican revolutionary figure and one of the figures pushing from essentialism to unificationism. That's a very broad picture. I think versions of both views remain sort of live today. I'm interested today in a short chapter in this long history, complex history of thought about laws of nature. I want to start by characterizing what I'm calling a weak unificationist view in Descartes. And then I want to present Spinoza's view in the ethics as a response to Descartes' views. Um, the thesis of the presentation today is that Spinoza defends strong versions of both essentialism and unificationism. So, although character figures like Hume set these up as opposing views, in Spinoza, they're supposed to be consistent. Um, and even the very sort of strongest versions of them are supposed to be consistent. Okay, so let me start with Descartes. Like other unificationists, Descartes wants to make nature uniform. His laws of nature describe uniformities in nature. Um, Descartes emphasizes, as an explanation for the respects in which nature is uniform, the character of God. Um, because God always acts in the same ways, the laws of nature unify corporeal effects. Bodies always act in the same ways because God's in control of causal processes. This is a familiar view in the early modern period. You see it in Berkeley, um, in Boyle. Um, I think the question of whether working scientists came to their views about law from views about God, or whether they changed their views about God in order to sort of sustain and reinforce their views about law, is an interesting, maybe unanswerable historical question. Um, in Descartes, the order of argument goes from the nature of God to the laws. So let's take a look at a few laws. This is from the second part of Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, 1644. Um, he writes, "We understand by perfection in God not only that he is immutable in himself, but also that he works in the most constant and immutable way." So there's a basis for finding nature uniform in the uniformity of God's character. As God moved the parts of matter in diverse ways when he created them, so now God conserves all the same matter in the same way that he first created it, always conserving the same amount of motion in it. Again, Principles 237 refers to God's immutability in the same way. Um, so you can see an illustration of inertial movement in from the principles. The stone in the sling ought to move from A to C. If it does something different, it needs to have something else changing it. So it's going to stay the same unless something else moves. Um, so that's the principles 237. Well, it's implied by principles 237 in Descartes' argument. The first of these laws is that each thing, insofar it's simple and undivided, always remains as much as is in it in the same state and is not changed except by external causes. Those of you familiar with Spinoza will recognize um, similar language, although metaphysically more heavy in terms of preservation rather than in terms of motion, from Ethics 3p6, the doctrine that all things, if sort of left to themselves, will persevere in being. Let me now say a few things about the ways in which Descartes' unificationism is weak. I'm going to emphasize two different ways. The first is simply that it doesn't the laws of nature for Descartes don't unify all existence in Descartes' metaphysics. Um, so you and I perhaps are materialists. We think that the only things that exist in the world um, are bodies, whatever bodies turn out to be. Descartes was not. So Descartes believed that God existed and was immaterial. Descartes believed in angels. Descartes believed that each human being has a mind that's a finite spirit, in other words, not a body. So when in Principles 2, Descartes offers us principles of material things, he offers laws that don't absolutely unify all existence. Instead, they unify material things. And that shows that the scope of Descartes' laws of nature is limited. The second respect in which Descartes' unification is weak is that even within the scope of the laws of nature, so even talking about material things, it's not clear that he doesn't allow exceptions. Um, so, for example, in voluntary motion, if I will to raise my arm and then my arm goes up, um, that might be a case where um, spirit is influencing body, and then the laws of nature wouldn't describe the origins of that movement. I'm not going to give an interpretation of Descartes' views on mind-body causal interaction today. That, of course, is a huge subject of research. Scholars still disagree about it. All I want to show is that Descartes struggled with this issue, and that in phrasing his accounts of the origins of corporeal effects, Descartes tended to leave room uh, for corporeal effects that arose from causes that weren't corporeal. Um, and so he wanted to leave room for exceptions to the laws of nature. And probably his views about this issue changed over time. So I want to cite a few different texts from different years. So here's Le Monde, early in Descartes' career, probably 1633. It wasn't published until the 1660s. You can see from the if you're quick with Roman numerals, as you can see from the front page of the book. And Descartes writes in Le Monde, it must be said that God alone is the author of all the motions in the world, insofar as they exist and insofar as they are rectilinear. But it is the various dispositions of matter which render them irregular and curved. Likewise, the theologians teach us that God is also the author of all our actions insofar as they exist and insofar as they have some goodness. But it is the various dispositions of our wills that can render them evil. So we're trying to work out who's responsible for what. Descartes has the traditional view that we're responsible for our own sins. It looks as though finite spirits are causing corporeal actions. After Descartes published the Meditations, Elizabeth of Bohemia was one of his most acute readers and one of his most acute critics, and she pressed him really hard on mind-body interaction. The Meditations was 1641. Here's Descartes' view um, in the Principles. He's careful now to be silent when it comes to mind-body interaction. So again, we're back in part 2 of the Principles. All the particular causes of changes that happen to bodies are secured in this third law, at least those that are themselves bodies. So we're talking about just those causes that are themselves bodies. For we do not here inquire whether and what kind of power human minds or angels have to move bodies. He's leaving open the question of whether there's mind-body interaction, and so he's leaving open the question of whether corporeal effects can have um, behavior that violates the laws of nature. Finally, in Passions of the Soul, which was the result of the long correspondence with Elizabeth. Um, this is he restated the doctrine of the pineal gland. So here's the whole pineal gland. Um, all the action of the soul consists in this, that solely by wanting something, it brings it about that the little gland to which it is closely joined moves itself in the way that is necessary for the production of the effect that corresponds to this volition. So I think people want to say it's very clear that Descartes endorses mind-body interaction. I just want to emphasize how subtle the language is in this passage. Um, it looks as though the little pineal gland, that's H in this diagram, um, moves itself in a way that's necessary for the production of the corporeal effect. Um, it's a reflexive verb in French, that's why. Um, we might ordinarily just translate that moves, and then it would look as though the pineal gland is maybe caused by the will. The will shoves it around, but if if the language is translated strictly, then it's the pineal gland moving itself. Um, Maybe it has some kind of sensitivity to the will that's not a causal sensitivity. Anyway, you can see Descartes wrestling with the issue about whether there's again this class of corporeal effects, the result of voluntary motion paradigmatically, that can be exceptions to the laws of nature, and that something else is needed to explain them. Okay, so let's turn now to Spinoza. Spinoza's main influence, I think, was Descartes. He was responding to many other figures. Um, as I'm going to present him here, I want to argue that the dominant doctrine of the ethics is essentialism, but that Spinoza is quite happy when he's responding directly to Descartes to use unifying language. Um, and that shows that he takes himself to hold a view of the laws of nature that's consistent with both views. Um, and I'm going to argue that's also sort of informed by concerns of the sort that move both essentialists and unificationists. So let's start with what I take to be the most consistently expressed view throughout the ethics, Spinoza's essentialism. So we've said on essentialism that an effect follows in a thing from laws of that thing's own nature. And Spinoza's strong essentialism is the view that all things are in God and all things follow from God, and all things follow from God in accordance with laws of God's own nature. It's a thoroughgoing essentialism. So some textual evidence for all of these views. Um, Ethics 1p15. Whatever is in God. Um, what precisely in means is something that critics dispute. Um, it can't just be physical containment because Spinoza admits all sorts of entities that aren't extended. Um, but some sort of being in relation characterizes all modes of God and God. All modes are in God. Also, all things follow from God. On 1p18 of the Ethics, God is the immanent, not in truth the transitive cause of all things. So immanent causation is causation in oneself, and that's typical of essentialism. Transitive is causation across two things, sometimes from a cause to an effect. Um, Spinoza makes God's causal activity immanent. I'm going to argue in a second that Spinoza um, makes any given effect um, an immanent effect. Um, Here's a nice statement of the view from later in part one of the Ethics. Solely from the necessity of the divine nature, God is the cause of itself and of all things. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is the strength of Spinoza's view. There aren't any exceptions to his essentialism. All things follow in God from God's own nature. We want to get the law talk in also. Notice the resemblance to the passages from Aquinas and Bacon here. We don't have laws of nature simpliciter. Um, we have laws of God's nature. God acts from laws of God's own nature alone and is constrained by nothing. Um, in the demonstration to 1p17, Spinoza writes, absolutely infinite things, and when Spinoza writes infinite, he usually just means all. Absolutely infinite things follow solely from the necessity of God's nature, or what is the same thing, solely from the laws of God's nature. I think so far the view I've offered is uncontroversial. Spinoza scholars, for the most part, wouldn't dispute it. I'm going to go on now and say that Spinoza's essentialism is still stronger than the view I've offered so far. This view is more controversial. Um, I'll try to provide a brief argument to support it. Um, but on this view, I want to say that in addition to God's causation, it's also true that all finite existence on Spinoza's account are effects that follow in a finite thing, and that they do so solely from laws of the finite thing's own nature. So here's a passage where Spinoza is introducing the idea, the notion, the concept of adequate ideas. So these are the counterpart to Descartes' clear and distinct ideas. Here's what Spinoza writes. For an effect that God causes, insofar as God is affected by an idea that is adequate in some mind, that same mind is the effect's adequate cause. So imagine God as a container that contains all things. Um, all the things in that container are going to be the effect of the container. But some of the items in the container will contain things themselves. So um, if a mind contains an idea, um, then just as God is the cause of that mind and that idea because they are contained in God, so the mind is the cause of the idea because the idea is contained in the mind. Okay. So there you have um, finite adequate causation. And that also is in its cause, as essentialism requires. It's nice to have the laws of its own nature talk applied to finite things. You can find that at definition 8 of Ethics 4. By virtue and power, I understand the same thing, namely virtue, insofar as it refers to a human being, is this same human being's nature or essence, to the extent that he has the ability to bring about those things that can be understood solely through the laws of his own nature. If you go back to the container analogy, um, Spinoza takes it to be equivalent to be fully in a cause and to be fully caused by laws of that cause's nature. So if I have an adequate idea, to go back to the last passage, that's an indication of my virtue or my power. Okay. And again, there's that language that's characteristic of uh, essentialist writings about laws and effects. It's not simply laws of nature, um, but it's per solus ipsius naturae legis, so laws of its own nature. Okay, so I've advertised that this view about finite essentialism is controversial. Let me tell you about the respect in which it's controversial before I try to respond. Um, Spinoza doesn't make all effects um, the effects of adequate causes. He allows, for example, the passions of the soul are partially caused from outside. Most of our most of our sensation, all of our ideas of imagination are partially caused from outside. So we have apparently transitive causation going on. And so, for example, when I see the sun, an example Spinoza uses frequently, the sun, in some sense, is going to be affecting my body, and that the resulting corporeal image on my body, which is the correlate in Spinoza's metaphysics to my visual idea of the sun, is going to be partially externally caused by the sun. It'll be a sort of a typical case of transitive causation. Um, so here's a general account of our passivity, the respect in which we can come to have these effects in us that are partially caused from outside of us. We say that we are passive whenever something arises in us of which we are merely the partial cause. That is, something that cannot be deduced solely from the laws of our own nature. We're passive, therefore, insofar as we are part of nature that cannot be conceived through itself without others. Um, so here's a case where Spinoza is saying some effects in us, for example, our visual idea of the sun, do not follow solely from the laws of our own nature. And so it looks as though Spinoza may not be a strong finite essentialist in the way that I've been advertising. Here's a response to this objection. It's true that if you just look at the finite mode that is my body, that mode is going to have effects in it that are partially caused by other things. But it's also true that each of these effects is going to be the uh, the product of an adequate finite cause, which is a finite thing. This follows from the definition of singular thing at Ethics 2, definition 7. By singular things, I understand things that are finite and have a determinate existence. If many individuals so assemble together in a single action that they are all at once the cause of one effect, I consider them all thus far to be one singular thing. So Spinoza, in this definition, he endorses something like a broad compositionality in his metaphysics, where um, the causal activity of two different things, say the sun and my body, um, in the production, suppose just the sun and my body are the partial causes of my corporeal image of the sun that's produced when I look at it. Um, Spinoza says, well, if we have all of these causes, all these partial causes together, they are to that extent one singular thing. So it's not the case that my body is the adequate cause of that effect, but it is the case that my body and the sun together, say, are the adequate cause of that effect. And so there is no effect that doesn't have um, some singular thing um, that produces it in virtue of laws of its nature. So it'll be laws of the sun's nature combined with laws of my nature that produce the corporeal image. And the sun LeBuffe hybrid singular thing is going to be the adequate cause of that effect. And so again, you have the strong finite essentialism that I was looking for. Okay. So Spinoza's essentialism, if this is correct, is really thoroughgoing. Not only do all things follow in God from laws of God's own nature, but all finite effects follow in finite things from laws of those finite things' natures. So I said that essentialism is Spinoza's preferred language. The majority of references to laws of nature in the ethics are references to laws of things natures. Still, when Spinoza addresses Descartes most directly, and here I'm thinking about the end of Ethics 2, where Spinoza's responding to Descartes' views about freedom of the will, through the beginning of Ethics 3, where Spinoza is giving his account of the human affects and his alternative account of what Descartes would refer to as freely willed mind-body causation. In those passages, Spinoza happily adopts Descartes' unificationist language. And from looking at that language, we can see that Spinoza is also a strong unificationist. So here's a passage from the preface to Ethics 3. In Ethics 3, Spinoza is setting out to give an account of the human affects. He mentions Descartes' passions of the soul, or he refers to Descartes, and I take him to be referring to the passions of the soul. He says, well, Descartes tried to do this also, um, but Descartes wasn't careful enough. And then he goes on to say what being careful, what following the right procedure means. And he writes, there's nothing in nature that can be attributed to a lapse in it. For nature is always the same, and its virtue and its power of acting are the same everywhere. That is, the laws and rules of nature, according to which all things follow and change from one form into others, are everywhere and always the same. Therefore, the method of understanding the nature of things of any kind whatever should be the same also, namely, through the universal laws and rules of nature. First, notice in this passage that Spinoza is not talking about laws of a thing's nature anymore. He's talking about laws of nature simpliciter. That's typical of unificationism, as I understand it. Notice second that Spinoza is not allowing the kinds of weakness that Descartes allowed in his accounts of laws of nature. So first, the laws are absolutely universal. There's no limitation in scope, whereas Descartes limited the laws to bodies, but also admitted other existence that weren't governed by the laws of nature. Spinoza insists the laws of nature concern everything. For example, Descartes is going to let human minds off the hook. He's not going to give laws of nature that describe the actions of human minds. Spinoza is not. He's going to say, we're going to give an account of human minds, of God, of all existence in terms of the universal laws of nature. Second, Spinoza rules out any lapses in the laws of nature. There aren't going to be exceptions for bodies or for anything else. These universal laws constrain, inform all the production of all effects. So there's an expression against Descartes of the strength of Spinoza's unificationism. So as I say, at the beginning of Ethics 3, Spinoza gives an account of human action, particularly in those cases that we would say might be cases of mind-body interaction and voluntary motion. He's just refuted Descartes' account of the human will. He doesn't think that there is a faculty of will, as Descartes did. And now he wants to give an account of human activity that is in line with his account of the laws of nature. We saw in the previous slide that he takes it to be a function of the unification provided by the laws of nature that his method is permitted. That once we know that all things behave in the same ways by the same laws, then we can say we can treat all things in the same ways. And here he is saying more about method at the end of the preface. I will treat the nature and violence of the human affects we would say emotions usually, and the power of the mind against them by the same method by which, in the preceding arguments, I treated God and the mind. I will consider human actions and appetites just as if it were an investigation of lines, planes, and bodies. So the vindication eventually of Descartes, of Spinoza's imitation of Euclid, the geometric method, follows from his idea that the laws of nature are fully uniform. That uniformity makes it reasonable to apply the same method to God, to the human mind, and to the human body. Okay, so we've seen then that Spinoza is both an essentialist and a unificationist. And I think that appreciating these strong commitments offers us a way into seeing why he's a substance monist. If you insist that um, a thing's effects follow from its own nature, and at the same time you're a strong unificationist on which exceptionalist and unifying laws of nature characterize all things, then you're committed to saying there is some nature from which follows um, every effect, and that effect has to follow inside that nature. So once you're a unificationist, if you're an essentialist, that's supposed to give you a motivation to be a substance monist. There must be this big container, God, and the laws of God's nature govern every effect. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. That was very interesting, and I felt Spinoza's view as a consequence. We're now going to hand over to our respondent. So Jinta Liu is from the Beijing University of Arts and Science, and he will now give a response to Mike's presentation. So Jinta, please start.
Okay. Should I share my screen?
Yes.
I have my commentary notes ready.
Yes, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, Professor LeBuffe, Professor Dantes, and everyone. My name is Jinze. I will now begin my commentary. It is a great honor to be invited by Professor LeBuffe as a commentator for his exquisite paper. As a Chinese philosopher who has never published in English peer-reviewed journals, I feel both privileged and somewhat daunted by this invitation, wondering whether I truly possess the qualifications to engage with his work. I should also note that my English pronunciation may pose challenges for comprehension, yet I will strive to share my understanding of the relevant issues. The central thesis of Professor LeBuffe's paper, as I perceive it, is that Spinoza metaphysics integrates essentialism and unificationism. Historically, these two positions represent distinct metaphysical approaches. The former maintains that a thing's essence explains its nature, whereas the latter holds that a thing's nature is determined by universal laws governing it. As Professor LeBuffe rightly observes, pre-modern philosophers largely adhered to an Aristotelian essentialist framework. Under the influence of the new science, however, early modern thinkers such as Descartes and Hume tended to embrace unificationism. What makes Spinoza's metaphysical projects particularly ambitious, then, is his systematic incorporation of both perspectives. In Professor LeBuffe's presentation, he began by introducing the essentialist position in the history of philosophy through references to texts by Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon, and went on to outline the unificationist perspective by drawing on passages from Newton and Hume. I find this selection of these sources well justified, as each indeed represents its respective tradition clearly. He then turned to Descartes' version of unificationism, characterizing it as weak. One key point he raised is that, for Descartes, the uniformity of nature derives not from nature itself, but from divine action. Here, I would note that Spinoza's position differs significantly. Rather than relying on a transcendent God to guarantee nature order, Spinoza regards nature as intrinsically and immanently unified. According to Professor LeBuffe, the weakness in Descartes' unificationism manifests in two main aspects. On one hand, Cartesian unificationism lacks comprehensiveness, while bodily substance conform to laws of nature. God and minds remain exempt from such deterministic governance. On the other hand, it permits exceptions, most notably through Descartes' allowance for miracles within the nature order. Furthermore, Descartes fails to provide a satisfactory account of the laws and mechanisms governing the human mind. Although he acknowledges mental operations as distinct from bodily motion, he offers no systematic explanation of their principled functioning. Following his exposition of Descartes' weak unificationism, Professor LeBuffe then turned to Spinoza's strong essentialism and strong unificationism. First, regarding Spinoza's essentialism, Spinoza adopts a robust essentialist position in metaphysics, which manifests in his assertions that all things are in God, all things follow from God, and all things occur in accordance with the laws of God's nature. Professor LeBuffe further pointed out that Spinoza endorses an essentialist view of finite causation. This position maintains that all finite existence are effects that arise within finite things and do so solely from the laws of their own natures. The essentialist account of finite causation thereby complements his broader framework of infinite essentialism. After examining Spinoza's strong essentialism, Professor LeBuffe proceeded to discuss his strong unificationism. In my view, the text he emphasized, the preface of part 3 of the Ethics, is of crucial importance, as it gives the clearest expression to Spinoza's robust unificationist stance. This passage serves as a direct critical of Descartes, arguing that Descartes' treatment of the human mind as an exception to the laws of nature undermines the strength of the unificationist position. Spinoza, by contrast, seeks to apply unificationism consistently and thoroughly. I would like to add that Spinoza expresses a similar viewpoint in his political works, the Theological Political Treatise and the Political Treatise. It is my contention that Spinoza's unificationism can and should be extended to his political philosophy as well. I find Professor LeBuffe's demonstration of the dynamic relationship between essentialism and unificationism particularly compelling. While essentialism provides substantive complementarity to unificationism, unificationism in turn imposes necessary constraints and regulatory frameworks upon essentialist propositions. His argument strikes me as both philosophically nuanced and analytically robust. The perspectives I have shared above represent my humble reflections on Professor LeBuffe's outstanding paper. I would like to express my sincere gratitude once again to Professor LeBuffe for this invitation, and also extend my thanks to Professor Dantes for their role in facilitating this meaningful exchange. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Mike, do you have anything you want to say in response?
Well, first, thanks a lot, Jinza. It's really great to have your commentary and have your careful reading of the paper. I know you worked your way through the longer written version of this paper, and I appreciate the comments that you sent me by email on that as well. You raised the question of what we're to think about Spinoza's use of references to law in his political works, and that's a huge, difficult question. I tend to agree with you that at least the background metaphysics that Spinoza assumes in both the theological political treatise and the political treatise are the metaphysics of the ethics. So when he talks about laws of nature in the theological political treatise, I take him to be talking about the laws of God's nature, or alternatively, just the laws of nature in the ethics. In correspondence with me, you raised some difficult questions about the relationship between the laws of nations, written law, and laws of nature. On that subject, I'm scared to say anything. There must be an interesting answer to the question of their relationship. And I recommended to you a paper that Donald Rutherford wrote as a first sort of crack at that relation. I think getting a handle on what Spinoza means by human written law must be informed by what he writes about natural law. And I think Donald Rutherford is on to a sort of good line there, but I don't have a settled view on that question. But certainly, I'm grateful to you for raising the issue of the relationship between the different texts, and that is a kind of a central issue that I haven't gotten to yet. So thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, now we're going to move on to the kind of Q&A section. So if anyone does have questions, you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom, or if you're not confident in your spoken English, you can always type your question into the chat, and I will read that question out for you on your behalf. As people think about what questions they might want to ask, I've got a few questions of my own. And actually, I was going to ask this question regardless, but you've brought up the laws of nation thing. So the question of how do we extend this kind of exceptionalist essentialism or strong unificationist perspective. Because I was thinking when you're going through the discussion of Descartes, what is kind of interesting about Descartes' weak unificationism is that there's kind of a suspicion that strong unificationism might be too strong. That if we might be able to talk about the way that material objects in the world work, and maybe they work in a consistent and exceptionalist way. But there's always this worry that when it comes to things of the social or the mental variety, it's much harder to work out how are these things going to work exceptionlessly. And of course, for Descartes, who has a belief in a soul, which is a non-material thing, those things are kind of operating at a different level of reality. So applying a strong unificationist perspective to mental slash soul phenomena would be odd because they just don't function or exist in the same way that tables, chairs, glasses of water, and things do. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about Descartes' perspective, is that, of course, there's a great analogy of that that's going on in contemporary philosophy of science and philosophy of the social sciences, and also the philosophy of the cognitive sciences, which is we seem to have a lot of success when it comes to exceptionalist unification or strong unificationist views in the hard sciences. But it's much harder to find the kind of regularities we're looking for in, say, the cognitive sciences, psychology, economics, and such like. And so there's kind of a temptation to go, well, look, Descartes may have been right to have been a weak unificationist. Because it turns out that being a strong unificationist actually may commit you to a kind of research program that actually not only doesn't bear much fruit, but actually might be making some fundamentally weird assumption about the metaphysics of all things, when really it's a story about the metaphysics of some particular things within the world. So I thought I'd just get your perspective on that bit first before we move on to Spinoza.
That's a great question, a great sort of series of questions. I'll try to, in answering, try to remember the lot, but remind me again if I skip something that you were interested in.
A classic philosopher's
Um,
question, and an essay where I want you to respond in 5 words.
um, so first, I mean, I think you're exactly right about this live issue and philosophy of science today. I think about Nancy Cartwright's sort of patchwork view, where we want to say the laws of nature remain important to us, but the sort of Newtonian unificationist ideal, um, beyond not being realizable, might actually interfere with productive, useful research programs. And we shouldn't conceive of the ideal as being as it is in that passage from Hume that I started with, where what we're trying to get is the very most general laws of nature. I think you can still be a unificationist and say that uh, other things being equal, a more general law has more explanatory power in virtue of the extent to which it unifies phenomena, without also insisting on there being absolutely universal laws of nature. So that point is very well taken, and I'm inclined to leave the issue to working scientists. It's sort of an indication of Spinoza's sort of all or nothing commitments in metaphysics that he starts by saying, "Oh, we're unificationists. That means there's going to be perfectly general laws of nature that govern all things, um, without any sort of investigation." Kind of a mark of Spinoza's rationalism. To get back to the case of Descartes in particular, um, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think that there are two different sorts of entities in the world, and by different sorts you mean something very robust, then it would be foolhardy to search for laws of nature that unify them all. Um, and so Descartes' response to Spinoza might be, what laws? Um, and I've asked myself that question about Spinoza also. Um, what laws does he have in mind? Descartes does have um, laws that unify all body, with the exception, as Jinza said, of miracles and, as I emphasized, of voluntary motion, perhaps. Um, but for Descartes, because the laws characterize the sorts of things that spirits just don't have. It's hard to imagine what sorts of laws of nature he would want to have. The answer for Spinoza, I think, and this is conjectural, are something like the axioms of the ethics. So um, we're not going to have the most general laws characterize, say, inertial motion, because spirits don't have motion, minds don't have motion. If there are very, very general inertial laws, they're going to be like Ethics 3p6, where they characterize the tendency of existence to stay in existence. Um, but the axioms are probably better candidates. So um, effects involve their causes. Um, that's going to be um, a law that applies to minds, bodies, and the other attributes all alike. Um, it's not going to characterize God as an effect, except insofar as God is an effect of God. But it will characterize God as a cause. Um, so the axioms of Ethics 1 are probably the best candidates for laws that Spinoza takes to characterize all things alike. Um, and when he writes at the end of the preface to Ethics 3 that because of the uniformity of the laws of nature, he's going to go ahead and treat the human affects in the same way that he's treated God and the mind. It seems to me that he's referring to his own method in the ethics. And so that's some sort of indirect evidence that he takes the axioms of the ethics to be the universal laws of nature. But it's only indirect evidence. He never calls them that.
Yeah, because the thing which I kind of find fascinating about the latter move that I'll try and say his name correctly, Spinoza says, which is going from laws of things to the kind of exceptionalist laws of nature perspective. I'm assuming he has to go for exceptionalist essentialism, become a substance monist because everything is coming from God. If you have laws of things and you've got multiple groups of things with their own sets of laws, then they sort of have to be unified by appeal to the Godhead. And therefore, you might as well just cut out the three sets. Well, actually, two sets would be simpler. Actually, one set would be simplest best. Therefore, it must be exceptionalist exceptionalism, therefore unificationist.
That's right. So if if Spinoza were working with Descartes' metaphysics, he might wind up saying um, there are two substances. If there's going to be laws that, or maybe if there's going to be laws that just characterize mind and different laws that just characterize body, um, then essentialism requires that we now have two substances. Um, and then, of course, mind-body interaction becomes a whole huge mess. It's gonna not be law governed.
Yes, which well, I mean, I remember doing in stage one metaphysics. As soon as you bring up dualism, you've got the well, how is this non-material mind affecting the quite clearly material brain? And so yeah, it kind of breaks down at that particular point of causality as we understand it.
Yeah, Descartes does offer a few uh, characterizations of causation broadly that do govern mind-body interaction. And here I'm treading into territory that remains controversial among Descartes scholars. But and I think philosophy up to Descartes and for a large part after Descartes relied heavily on causal likeness. In order for two things to interact, they had to be um, meaningfully similar. And causal likeness wasn't going to work for mind-body interaction. The whole point is that these things are dramatically unlike. So causal characterizations in Descartes tend to move away from causal likeness. In the third meditation, he invokes notoriously, I think, a causal reality principle, where there has to be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. That's the sort of principle that I'm looking for in the ethics when I'm trying to find a law that governs both minds and bodies. As long as causation occurs for both minds and bodies, this causal law in Descartes will govern everything.
Now, are there any questions or comments people want to interject with or ask? Jinsa, do you have anything you'd like to ask?
My spoken English is not sufficient to support a conversation.
That is quite all right. Quite all right. Although if you want to type anything into the chat, please do so. Because I was to go back to the laws of nation thing, and this is entire speculation on my part, not knowing the Spinoza literature at all well. Could you posit a kind of law of nature about nations by talking about the ideal way that the Godhead would want to arrange circumstances within the world? So a good law of nations is going to be something which reflects the ideal arrangement the Godhead would have. And therefore you can tell what's a good law of nation by resemblance to how God would order things, versus a bad law of nations is one which would go against God's divine order.
I'm sure Jinza has a view about this. Jinza, you can review the video and and try to figure out what Em just said. Um, I think yes and no from my perspective. So Spinoza is very anxious in both in the ethics, but also in his political works to move away from the idea of God as a prince that matters so much to um, so much medieval and early modern philosophy. Um, uh, I like to say that he thinks of God as not a director but a producer. Um, God doesn't regulate human activity so much as that it issues from God. Um, Having sort of worked to distance himself from that in his ethics and his politics. Um, I think Spinoza does think that um, a well done human law um, builds on natural regularities. So the ethics is on my brain right now rather than the theological political treatise. So I'll talk about the ethics. There's a few long scholia in part four of the ethics on politics. And there, Spinoza sort of starts with the imagination that um, although we are weak and passion-ridden finite modes trying to get along, um, there is when we're free enough, a way that we act that's fully rational. So I'm usually just swayed by my passion. If I'm walking by a chocolate bar, I just move to the chocolate bar. Um, but sometimes in the right circumstances, say when there aren't any chocolate bars present, then I'll do what I should be doing. And giving an account of human law, Spinoza starts saying, um, well, if we were all rational all the time, we wouldn't need laws. We would get along in perfect harmony. Um, such so that what a good what a good system of human laws does is it works to help us behave rationally when we wouldn't otherwise. So we start with an idea of what human nature is, um, and of how things around us affect us. And we work from that to construct an environment in which, despite the fact that we're sort of feeble and super finite and super passionate, we're able to act as rationally as possible. So it's an account of maybe um, the way things could be given the way we are that informs Spinoza's account of written law. So he somehow comes close in the end to founding an account of written law on an account of the natures of human beings.
Okay, so to use a wildly post Spinoza figure, he's more Kantian than he is Augustinian.
Uh, that's hard. Um, I'll go ahead and say yes, he is. I would tend to say that Kant is more Spinozistic than Augustinian, but
Yeah, I mean,
I have those two views.
after Spinoza. That's why I said I'm using the alpha sequence here because it would be better to say that counters a development of a kind of Spinozian view there. But I was trying to search for two diametrically opposite political philosophers, Augustine, where it's kind of divine command theory, versus Kant, which is going, well, actually, no, God kind of has to obey rules as well. So there's a unification there, but it's between similarity as opposed to no, God has just said X. Yeah.
I hesitate because Spinoza's politics is given in the course of his sort of development of laws of reason, which for him are sort of analogous, at least, to moral laws. Um, and some of what Spinoza writes about moral laws is proto-Kantian. But my my limited familiarity with Kant um, suggests that there's a sort of a strict divide between ethics and politics in Kant. Um, so that um, it's true that Kantian society aims at the good life for human beings, but there's a bunch of sort of further facts about the way we get along together that stand between, say, the kingdom of ends and Kant's account of political societies. Hey, we have a question from Jin.
As a question, I'll read it out for the crowd. Is it possible to formulate a viable defense of Cartesian weak unificationism against Spinoza's objections?
That's a good question. In the context of the ethics, the debate focuses on human voluntary action, and the best discussion in the ethics is in the scholium to the second proposition of Ethics 3. There, Spinoza sort of raises in a Cartesian voice the idea that, um, well, look, it, I will to raise my arm, and my arm goes up. Um, it how is a law of nature going to explain that effect fully? It might constrain what my arm does, but it's not going to give a complete account of it. And Spinoza's Spinoza's response, first, I think that's a good Cartesian objection that um, freedom of the will still has freedom of the will still has its adherents, and for good reason, that it's very hard to explain human free action. M sort of invoked this idea already in talking about the sort of intractability of cognitive science and social science in terms of unificationism. Cartesian would leap on a similar idea, saying, "Well, human beings act from free will, and free will is not governable by um, these universal laws that you're invoking." Spinoza's response in the second the scholium to the second proposition is to say there's all kinds of things that bodies do that we can't explain, um, but we don't just sort of grasp at a miracle every time we can't explain something that a body does. Instead, we wait until we know more about bodies. Um, so, for example, Spinoza invokes sleepwalking, and he sort of puts into the mouths of a Cartesian interlocutor the idea that sleepwalking is not a case of willed action. It's just something very strange that some bodies do, and um, we hold out sort of a promissory note. We hold out hope that eventually, when we know more about human brains and human physiology and so on, we'll be able to explain sleepwalking. Spinoza says, well, if that's what you say in the case of this difficult phenomenon, uh, why is it that you just leap to the idea that there's a spirit that pushes the arm up in willed human action? You should issue the same sort of promissory note and say, here's another interesting phenomenon that um, we hope eventually in the dissection labs at Leiden to be able to explain. Um, so, I think it is possible to formulate um, a defense of Descartes. Um, all you need to do is to say, this is a corporeal phenomenon that isn't going to be explained by any corporeal law. Um, and Spinoza's response um, is it legitimate to resort to some kind of extracorporeal cause that you can't characterize in terms of law? So, yeah, no, that's a good objection. I think people um, could still put themselves on either side of this debate. Another thing to say about Cartesian unificationism um, is that the Cartesian might object to Spinoza's essentialism. There are some essentialist passages in Descartes, um, but for the most part, he's happy to say, I'm not going to look into bodies in order to explain what they're doing. Um, so he might object to sort of the whole project of that scholium to part two of Ethics 3 by saying, look, dig as deep as you like. You're not going to be able to find in bodies any source of any sort of explanation for what they do. That's a kind of a Humean unificationist move that the powers of action are um, going to be given by God. So that's sort of two responses that a Cartesian might have to Spinoza. The first is that um, allowing exceptions to the laws of nature is permissible when those exceptions couldn't possibly be explained by laws of nature. Um, and the second is giving an account of regularities in nature in virtue of something else rather than the things themselves is justified because the search for explanation in the things themselves never turns up um, an answer to our questions. It's just regularities that we're going to find. So there's a lot to discuss there. It's a great question.
Yeah, and that actually quite happily also mirrors the kind of realist, anti-realist debate going on in the philosophy of science and science itself, where, I mean, this is often taken to be one of the issues in the philosophy of science. Philosophers of science love realism. They like, go, look, we're finding these exceptionalist laws of nature, and then actual practicing scientists go, no, we're just looking for regularities. We're not making any claims about whether they're true. We're just looking for regularities within the world because they're kind of useful for doing more science. But it doesn't commit us to any claim about these regularities being fundamental truths of the world.
Thanks, Sam. That seems right to me. I presented essentialism as a very, very old doctrine. I think it is. It is an Aristotelian doctrine, and I think it has the sorts of vulnerabilities that you just mentioned. But you're right also to say this is a live debate, that um, people don't want their description of effects in nature to be just the description of uniformities. It feels like it's not enough. And so philosophers of science who look for powers or dispositions in things are carrying on in the essentialist tradition, saying, um, well, we're going to explain the effects that a thing has by referring to some kind of property that it has. Um, if a leaf is falling more slowly than a cannonball, um, there are going to be salient differences between the leaf and the cannonball that explain the differences.
So we don't seem to have any other questions unless Jinsa wants to type something else into the chat.
That's okay. I'll just thank you, Jinsa, and thank you, M, and those of you silently in the audience. Thanks very much. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you today, and I'm very happy, Jinsa or others in the audience. If you have further questions about this work, I'm always happy to receive your emails.
Thank you,
I
Mike.
have questions.
Oh, Jinsa, sorry.
No more questions from me.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks
then
very much.
I will call this one in. It was an absolutely fascinating conversation, and hopefully I'll see some of you again in a future seminar. Otherwise, it's good afternoon from me here in Guangzhou, here in mainland China, and I believe it's good. Well, is it still a good evening where you are, Mike, or has the weather settled or got worse?
A windy blue sky in Dunedin. It's very nice.
It's a stunning afternoon in Dunedin then.
Okay.
All right, everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you.